Hey there, math fans and everyone else. Let's face it, math can seem about as fun as a root canal. We've all been there, staring at equations like they're written in ancient Sanskrit. But what if I told you there's a way to use math in your everyday life that won't make your brain melt? No, seriously. We're not talking about trigonometry or calculus here. Today, we're diving into a book that's all about the power of mathematical. Think of it like this. Math isn't just about numbers. It's about logic, patterns, and making sense of the world around us. So buckle up as we explore how not to be wrong. The Power of Mathematical Thinking by Jordan Ellenberg. Don't worry, you won't need a PhD in anything to follow along. Now you might be wondering, who is this Jordan Ellenberg and why should I care what he has to say about math? Well, let me tell you, this guy is like the math whisperer. He's a mathematician who can actually explain things in a way that normal humans can understand. Ellenberg's book isn't your typical math textbook. It's more like a collection of stories, insights, and aha moments that show you how math pops up in unexpected places. We're talking everything from election predictions to figuring out the best time to leave work to avoid rush hour. It's about using logic and reasoning skills to make better choices. So, how exactly does math help us navigate the real world, you ask? Well, let's start with the fact that we're constantly bombarded with information. News headlines, social media, that friend who always has an opinion on everything. It's overwhelming. But here's the thing. Not all information is created equal. Mathematical thinking gives you the tools to sift through the noise and figure out what's really going on. Think of it like having a built-in BS detector. All right, let's talk about mathematical thinking. Now, before you picture yourself hunched over a desk, scribbling away at equations, take a deep breath. It's not about becoming a human calculator, it's about approaching the world with a certain mindset, a way of thinking that helps you cut through the clutter and make smarter choices. You see, mathematicians, they're like detectives. They look for patterns, they question assumptions, and they don't just accept things at face value. It's more about cultivating a certain curiosity, a skepticism that says, show me the evidence. Now, when we talk about logic in this context, we're not talking about winning arguments with your friends or outsmarting your cat, though that would be impressive. We're talking about a systematic way of thinking that helps us connect the dots between information and draw sound conclusions. Let's say you're trying to figure out why your internet is being wonky. A logical approach would be to rule out the possibilities one by one. Is the router plugged in? Check. Is the Wi-Fi turned on? Check. Have you tried turning it off and on again? Of course you have. And here's the thing about logic. It applies to pretty much every aspect of life. It's like having a mental map that guides us through unfamiliar territory. So we've established that mathematical thinking is cool, it's useful, and it doesn't require a pocket protector. But you might still be wondering, how does this actually play out in my everyday life? Well, my friend, let me count the ways. See what I did there? Remember that time you were trying to figure out the best deal on laundry detergent? You were comparing sizes, prices, maybe even doing some mental math to figure out the cost per ounce. That's mathematical thinking in action. Or how about when you're planning a road trip? You're using math to calculate distances, estimate travel time, and maybe even figure out the most fuel-efficient route. All right, let's start with the basics. Linear thinking. Imagine a nice straight line on a graph. That's linear thinking in a nutshell. It's the idea that things happen in a predictable, proportional way. 1 apple plus 1 apple equals 2 apples. 2 apples plus 2 apples equal 4 apples. You get the idea. It's the kind of math that makes sense, right? We encounter linear thinking all the time in our daily lives. If you drive twice as fast, you'll get there in half the time, in a perfect world, at least. If you buy twice as much groceries, you'll spend twice as much money, unless you're like me and get distracted by the sample tables. Enter nonlinear thinking. This is where things get interesting and a little bit wild. Instead of that straight, predictable line, imagine a roller coaster of a graph, full of twists, turns, and loop-de-loops. That's nonlinear thinking in action. In a nonlinear world, small changes can have huge, unpredictable consequences. It's like the butterfly effect. One flap of its wings in Brazil can set off a chain reaction that leads to a hurricane in Florida. Remember that traffic jam we talked about earlier? That's a prime example of non-linearity. Here's the thing about non-linearity. It's everywhere. The stock market, the weather, relationships, your sleep schedule after eating an entire pizza at midnight. These are just a few examples of systems that don't play by linear rules. When we try to apply linear thinking to non-linear situations, that's when we get into trouble. We make assumptions that turn out to be false. We underestimate risks. We get caught off guard by unexpected consequences. But here's the good news. Understanding non-linearity gives us a superpower. The ability to anticipate the unexpected, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to make smarter choices in a world that often feels like it's gone completely bonkers. All right, folks. Get ready for a concept that sounds way more complicated than it actually is, the law of large numbers. Don't let the fancy name intimidate you. It's a pretty simple idea once you break it down. The more you repeat something, the closer the results get to what you'd expect based on probability. Think about flipping a coin. Flip it 10 times and you might get 7 heads and 3 tails, but flip it 1,000 times and the results get closer to 50-50. It's like magic, but with math. Let's take a trip to Las Vegas, shall we? Casinos are basically giant, flashing monuments to the law of large numbers. They're designed to make money, and they do that by playing the odds. Every game, from slot machines to blackjack to roulette, is set up so that over time, the house will always come out on top. Now, this doesn't mean you can't walk into a casino and win some money. People do it all the time. But those wins are just blips on the radar compared to the constant stream of small losses that the casino rakes in from all those games being played. It's like that old saying, the house always wins. They're playing the long game, my friends, and they're playing it well. Here's the thing about the law of large numbers. It's easy to misunderstand. Our brains are wired to look for patterns, even when they don't exist. We see a few wins in a row, and we think we're on a winning streak. We see a few bad things happen, and we start to think we're cursed. But the law of large numbers tells us not to get too caught up in those short-term fluctuations. Just because you flipped 5 heads in a row doesn't mean the coin is rigged. The key is to keep things in perspective. Don't make big decisions based on small sample sizes. And remember, sometimes randomness just happens. Even when you think you've got it all figured out, life can throw you a curveball. All right, let's talk about a phenomenon that's always messing with our heads, regression to the mean. It's a fancy way of saying that things tend to even out over time. You know how sometimes you have a crazy good day where everything goes your way? Yeah, well, don't get used to it, because chances are tomorrow will be a little more, shall we say, average. Think of it like this. Imagine you're flipping a coin 100 times. You might get a streak of 10 heads in a row, but over time, the number of heads and tails will start to even out. It's like the universe has a way of course-correcting, bringing things back to a sort of equilibrium. Well, hold on to your hats, because regression to the mean applies to way more than just games of chance. Games. Let's start with sports, because who doesn't love a good underdog story? Or, a good overdog story, depending on who you're rooting for. You've heard of the sophomore slump, right? When a rookie athlete has an amazing first year, everyone's all excited, they're on the cover of magazines, and then bam! Their performance dips the next year. Now, sometimes there are legitimate reasons for this: injuries, pressure, maybe they just partied a little too hard during the off-season. But often, it's just regression to the mean doing its thing. That first year was exceptional, a statistical outlier, and it's unlikely they'll be able to maintain that level of performance consistently. And it's not just sports. Remember that time you aced a test without even trying? You felt like a genius, right? Well, chances are you didn't suddenly develop superhuman intelligence overnight. You were probably due for a good grade, and statistically speaking, it was unlikely you'd ace the next one too. Here's the thing about regression to the mean. It can really mess with our heads if we're not careful. We start to see patterns where there are none. We get overly optimistic when things are going well and overly pessimistic when things take a downturn. But here's the good news. Understanding regression to the mean gives us a superpower, the power of perspective. When we understand that things tend to even out over time, we can ride the waves of life's ups and downs with a little more grace and a lot less drama. So the next time you find yourself on a winning streak, enjoy it, celebrate your successes, but don't be surprised if things level out eventually. Section 1. Statistical illusions. Seeing what's not there. Let's talk about statistical illusions. They're like optical illusions, patterns that aren't really there. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines. We look for order in chaos. But sometimes this leads us astray. Think about shark attacks. We see a few stories and think sharks are everywhere, but correlation does not equal causation. Sometimes it's just a coincidence. Let's talk about basketball, shall we? Specifically, let's talk about the hot hand fallacy. You know what I'm talking about? When a player makes a few shots in a row and everyone starts saying they're on fire or they've got the hot hand. It's like they've suddenly tapped into some mystical basketball power and they can't miss. But here's the thing, statistically speaking, the hot hand doesn't exist. Studies have shown that basketball players aren't actually more likely to make a shot just because they made the previous few shots. It's a cognitive bias, a way for our brains to see patterns where there are none. We remember those streaks of made shots more vividly than the missed ones, and we attribute it to some kind of hot streak, even though it's just random variation. Now, this doesn't mean that momentum doesn't exist in basketball. Of course, confidence and rhythm play a role in performance. But the idea that a player is inherently hot or cold based on their previous shots, that's just our brains playing tricks on us. Section 3. From basketball courts to conspiracy theories. Here's the thing about statistical illusions. They're not just harmless fun, they can have real-world consequences. Think about it. People make investment decisions based on perceived patterns in the stock market, only to lose their shirts when those patterns turn out to be illusory. We make judgments about individuals based on stereotypes and generalizations, failing to see the unique human being in front of us. And then there are the conspiracy theories. Oh boy, the conspiracy theories. The internet is a breeding ground for statistical illusions, with people connecting dots that don't exist, seeing patterns in random events, and constructing elaborate narratives to explain the unexplainable. Now, I'm not saying that all coincidences are meaningless or that there's never any foul play afoot, but we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions based on flimsy evidence or perceived patterns that might not actually exist. We have to be willing to question our assumptions, to consider alternative explanations, and to admit when we might be letting our desire for order and meaning cloud our judgment. Section 1. Math, not just for nerds anymore. So there you have it, folks. We've journeyed through the wacky, wonderful world of How Not to Be Wrong by Jordan Ellenberg, and guess what? We survived. More importantly, we've debunked the myth that math is just for rocket scientists and accountants. Turns out math is for everyone. Who knew, right? This book, my friends, is like a secret decoder ring for understanding the world around us. It's about seeing the hidden math in everyday situations, from sports stats to supermarket deals, to those too good to be true internet offers, which, let's be honest, are always too good to be true. The best part? You don't need to be a math whiz to apply these concepts. Ellenberg breaks down complex ideas into bite-sized, digestible pieces that even the most math-phobic among us can understand. It's like having a friendly math tutor in your back pocket, ready to swoop in and save the day whenever you're faced with a tricky decision or a baffling statistic. Section 2. Level up your decision-making skills. Now, I know what you're thinking. Bill, this all sounds great, but how does it actually help me in my everyday life? Well, my friend, let me count the ways. See what I did there. Understanding mathematical thinking can help you make smarter decisions. Whether you're choosing a retirement plan, evaluating investment opportunities, or just trying to figure out if that sale is really worth it, a little math can go a long way. Spot BS a mile away. From misleading statistics in the news to those miracle cures advertised on late-night infomercials, the world is full of people trying to sell you something. Mathematical thinking helps you cut through the noise and see things for what they really are. Become a more critical thinker. In the age of information overload, it's more important than ever to be able to think critically and evaluate information objectively. Mathematical thinking gives you the tools you need to separate fact from fiction and make sound judgments. Section 3. Embrace the power of thinking mathematically. So, there you have it. Mathematical thinking is not just for mathletes and number nerds. It's a superpower we all possess, waiting to be unleashed. By embracing the principles in how not to be wrong, we can become more informed, more discerning, and ultimately more empowered individuals. Remember, folks, the world is a messy, unpredictable place. But with a little math on our side, we can navigate the chaos, make smarter choices, and maybe even have a little fun along the way. After all, who doesn't love a good aha moment? Especially when it comes with the satisfaction of knowing you've outsmarted the odds, or at least understood them a little better. So, go forth, my friends, and think mathematically. The world needs your logic, your critical thinking skills, and your ability to spot a statistical illusion from a mile away. And hey, if you happen to win the lottery along the way, well, just remember who gave you the tools to understand those odds. Just saying.